The June heat in Charlotte, North Carolina was suffocating as I adjusted my tie one last time in the rearview mirror. The fabric felt rough against my fingers, a polyester blend that had seen better days, maybe 15 years ago. My reflection stared back at me, a 50-year-old man in a suit that had witnessed countless job interviews, funerals, and family gatherings. The navy blue had faded to something closer to midnight gray, and the shoulders pulled slightly. When I moved my arms, "Dad, you ready for this circus?" Emma asked from the passenger seat, scrolling through her phone. 26, she had inherited her mother's sharp wit and my stubborn streak, a dangerous combination that had gotten her through law school and into one of Charlotte's top firms. "As ready as anyone can be for your Aunt Patricia's annual Judgment Festival," I replied, checking my watch. We were already 10 minutes late, which meant Patricia would have something to say about punctuality before we even made it through the front door. Emma looked up from her phone, studying my appearance with the critical eye of someone who spent her days in courtrooms. "You know, Dad, we could have gone shopping for a new suit," I offered. "This one's fine," I said, getting out of the car. The truth was more complicated than that. The suit had history. It was the first one I'd bought after leaving the Navy 18 years ago. It had carried me through my transition into civilian life, through job interviews at 3 different aerospace companies, through promotions and setbacks, through Susan's funeral 5 years ago, the Reynolds. Family reunion was in full swing when we arrived at Patricia's sprawling suburban home. Cars lined both sides of the street, BMWs, Mercedes, a few Teslas that screamed new money. My 10-year-old Honda Civic looked like the poor relation among them, which I supposed was fitting. "Frank," Patricia's voice cut through the afternoon air like a blade. She was standing on her front porch, resplendent in what looked like a designer sundress. Her husband Richard beside her in khakis and a polo shirt that probably cost more than I spent on groceries in a month. "You made it, and you brought him wonderful." The hug Patricia gave me was perfunctory, the kind reserved for distant relatives you tolerate rather than enjoy. But Emma got the full treatment, genuine warmth, excited questions about her career, compliments on her appearance. "Come on, everyone's in the backyard," Patricia said, leading us through her perfectly appointed house. Every surface gleamed, every decoration was precisely placed. It was the kind of home that made you afraid to touch anything. The backyard was a masterpiece of suburban excess professional landscaping. An outdoor kitchen that could have serviced a restaurant, a pool that belonged in a resort brochure. About 40 people were scattered across the space, most of them wearing the uniform of successful middle-class America, designer. Casual wear that looked effortless, but cost a small fortune. I felt their eyes on me immediately. It wasn't just paranoia. I could see the quick glances, the subtle double takes, the way conversations paused as I passed. My suit stood out like a sore thumb among the carefully curated casualness of everyone else's attire. Oh, look who decided to dress up for the occasion, came a voice from my left. Dale, Patricia's husband's brother, stood there with a craft beer in his hand and a smirk on his face. He was wearing shorts that probably cost more than my monthly utilities bill and a shirt with a little polo player on it. "Hello, Dale," I said, evenly. Emma stepped closer to me, her lawyer instincts picking up on the undercurrent of mockery. "I mean, we appreciate the effort, Frank, but, you know, this isn't a board meeting, right?" Dale continued, encouraged by the chuckles from his small audience. "You can relax a little." More people were starting to pay attention now. I could feel the weight of their scrutiny, the way they were cataloging my appearance and finding it wanting. The suit that had once made me feel professional and confident now felt like a costume from a different era. "Dad always likes to look his best," Emma said, her voice carrying a warning edge that anyone who knew her would recognize. "Oh, I'm sure he does," said Melissa, Dale's wife, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "It's just that some of us have moved on from the 80s, you know? Fashion evolves." The group laughed, and I felt something cold settle in my stomach, not anger. Exactly, I'd faced worse than this during my Navy years, but something deeper, more personal. These were Susan's relatives, people who had supposedly loved and respected my wife. Yet here they were, treating me like I was some kind of curiosity, a relic from a bygone era. "I think Dad looks distinguished," Emma said firmly, but I could hear the tension in her voice. She was getting ready to fight, and I couldn't let that happen. Not here, not at a family gathering that was supposed to honor Susan's memory. "It's fine, sweetheart," I murmured, placing a hand on her arm. "Why don't you go find your cousins? I'll be fine here." But Emma didn't move. If anything, she stepped closer, her body language protective in a way that made my heart ache. Been doing this since her mother died, trying to shield me from the world's casual cruelties, as if her fierce loyalty could somehow make up for Susan's absence. The conversation continued around us, touching on careers and vacations and home renovations. I contributed when asked direct questions, but mostly I listened, observing the social dynamics that Susan had navigated so effortlessly. Without her translation, I often felt like I was speaking a different language at these gatherings. "So Frank," said Tom, Patricia's eldest son, "what have you been up to lately? Still doing the engineering thing? Still working?" I replied. "Defense. Contracts, mostly. Aerospace systems. Still living in the military world," Tom said with a knowing nod. "Some guys never really leave, do they?" The comment stung more than it should have. Yes, I worked in defense contracting, but that was because my skills and experience were valued there. I'd built a successful career translating military requirements into civilian applications, bridging to worlds that often didn't understand each other. "Well, you can take the man out of the uniform, but you can't take the uniform out of the man," Dale added, gesturing at my suit. Hence the formal wear at a backyard barbecue. More laughter. I felt Emma tense beside me, her hand clenching into a fist. She was her mother's daughter, fiercely protective of the people she loved, quick to anger when she perceived injustice. But she was also my daughter, which meant she understood the value of choosing your battles carefully. "Dad," she said quietly. "Maybe we should know," I said, my voice firm but quiet. "We're staying. Your mother would have wanted us to be here." The mention of Susan seemed to dampen some of the mockery, but not all of it. These people had loved my wife in their way, but they'd never really understood what she saw in me. I was too quiet, too serious, too different from their world of golf club memberships and wine tastings and charity galas as the afternoon wore on. The comments became more pointed. Someone mentioned seeing a commercial for a men's clothing store that was having a sale. Another person brought up an article they'd read about dressing appropriately for different occasions. The subtext was clear. I was a social embarrassment. A man who didn't understand basic civilian etiquette. I endured it all with the patience I'd learned during 18 years of military service. I'd faced enemy fire over the Persian Gulf head, landed fighter jets on carrier decks in storms that would have terrified most people. A few relatives making jokes about my clothes should have been nothing, but it wasn't nothing, because Emma was there, watching it all, her face growing more flushed with each passing comment. She was seeing her father diminished in front of people who should have treated him with respect. If not for his own sake, then for her mother's memory. The sun was starting to set when Patricia called everyone together for the traditional group photo. As we gathered on the patio, I could hear the whispered conversations, the sideways glances, the barely suppressed laughter. My suit, which had seemed perfectly appropriate when I put it on that morning, now felt like a target painted on my back. "Maybe you could stand in the back," Patricia suggested, her smile brittle. "You're quite a bit taller than most everyone else." The suggestion wasn't unreasonably, was 6'3" in a family of average height people. But the way she said it, the apologetic tone that suggested my presence, was somehow problematic. Made it clear that my height wasn't the real issue. Took my place in the back row, Emma beside me, her hand finding mine and squeezing tight. As the photographer counted down, I realized that this might be the last Reynolds family reunion I would attend. It's not because I couldn't handle the judgment, but because I couldn't watch my daughter suffer through it anymore. The photo-taken people began to disperse back to their smaller conversations. I was preparing to suggest to Emma that we leave when I heard Dale's voice, louder than it needed to be, carrying across the patio. "Poor old Frank," he was saying to his wife, still wearing the same suit he probably bought when Reagan was president. You'd think by now he'd have figured out how to dress like an adult. Yeah, that was it. I felt Emma go rigid beside me, saw her take a step forward, her mouth opening to deliver what I knew would be a devastating response. My daughter had inherited her mother's fierce loyalty and her father's strategic mind when she decided to destroy someone verbally. She did it with surgical precision. But this wasn't her fight to finish. It was mine. The evening air in Charlotte had cooled slightly, but the tension on Patricia's patio was thick enough to cut with a knife. I could feel Emma vibrating with anger beside me, her entire body coiled like a spring, ready to release. She'd heard Dale's comment about my suit we all had danned. I knew she was about to unleash the full force of her legal training on him. "Emma," I said quietly, my hand on her arm. "Not yet." "Dad, I can't, please."
Right.
My voice carried the authority. I'd learned as a naval officer, and she reluctantly stepped back. Though her eyes never left Dale's smug face, the group had formed a rough circle around the outdoor bar, drinks in hand, the alcohol making them bolder and less careful with their words. I stood at the edge, feeling like an outsider looking in, at a world I'd never quite mastered. "I mean, come on," Dale continued, apparently not satisfied with his earlier jab. "We're not asking the man to show up in a tuxedo, but a little situational awareness would be nice. This is 2024, not 1985. Melissa nodded sagely, swirling her wine glass. "Some people just get stuck, you know. They can't adapt to change." "Actually kind of sad when you think about it." "Sad is right," agreed Tom, Patricia's son. He was holding court now, emboldened by the audience and the open bar. "I mean, Susan always made sure Frank looked appropriate at these things. Without her," he let the sentence hang in the air, the implication clear. "Without my wife, I was lost, unable to function in basic social situations." The narrative was forming around me, the helpless widower, clinging to the past, unable to navigate the complexities of modern life. "It's not just the clothes," said Jennifer, Tom's wife, her voice carrying the authority of someone who considered herself an expert on social etiquette. "It's the whole package."
Ouch.
The way he stands apart from everyone like he's judging us. The way he doesn't really participate in conversations. "Military bearing," Dale said with a knowing nod. Some guys never learn to turn it off. They stay in that rigid, formal mindset their whole lives. I felt Emma's hand slip into mine, her fingers intertwining with mine in a gesture of solidarity. She was trembling with suppressed rage, and I knew that my quiet acceptance of their criticism was torturing her almost as much as the words themselves. The truth was, their observations weren't entirely wrong. I did maintain military bearing. It was as much a part of me as my eye color or my height. I did stand apart from groups, observing before engaging. I did prefer listening to talking in social situations. These weren't character flaws. They were survival skills I'd developed over 18 years of military service. But to these people, my differences weren't just quirks. They were evidence of my inability to fit into their world. Proof that I was somehow less than they were. "The thing is," Jennifer continued, warming to her theme, "we all understand that grief changes people. We get that Frank is probably struggling since Susan died, but it's been 5 years now. At some point, you have to move forward." "Exactly," Patricia chimed in, her voice carrying the authority of the family matriarch. Susan wouldn't have wanted Frank to stay frozen in time like this. She would have wanted him to grow, to adapt, to find joy again. The casual invocation of my dead wife's wishes hit me like a physical blow. These people, who had seen Susan maybe 3 times a year, who had made polite conversation at holiday gatherings, but never really known her, were now presuming to speak for her, to interpret what she would have wanted from me. Maybe someone should. "Take him shopping," Melissa suggested with a giggle. It's like one of those makeover shows. Queer eye for the military guy? The laughter that followed was loud and cruel, and I felt something inside me start to fracture. Break I'd endured. Worse than this during my military career? But fracture, like a stress crack in metal that grows wider under repeated pressure. Emma pulled her hand free from mine and stepped forward, her voice cutting through the laughter like a blade. "That's enough." The group turned to look at her, their expressions ranging from surprised to amused. They'd forgotten she was there, or perhaps they'd assumed she shared their opinions about her father's shortcomings. "Excuse me?" Dale said, his eyebrows raised in mock concern. "I think we were just having a friendly conversation about humiliating my father at a family gathering." Emma interrupted, her voice steady and cold. "About making fun of a man who's shown you nothing but respect since the moment he walked in here, Emma sweetheart," Patricia said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "We're not making fun of anyone. We're just concerned about your father's adjustment." "His adjustment," Emma repeated, her tone making it clear what she thought of that euphemism. "You mean his failure to dress like you, think like you, act like you?" "Well, when in Rome," Tom said with a shrug. "This isn't Rome," Emma shot back. "This is a family gathering. A place where people are supposed to be accepted and loved for who they are, not criticized for failing to meet your arbitrary standards of appropriate behavior." I could see the group's dynamics shifting. Emma's legal training was showing she was systematically dismantling their position, forcing them to confront the cruelty behind their casual mockery. "Nobody's being cruel," Jennifer said defensively. "We're just saying that maybe it's time for Frank too." "To what?" Emma demanded. "To pretend to be someone he's not so you'll feel more comfortable? To abandon the principles and bearing that define him as a person? To adapt," Dale said, his voice rising slightly, "to recognize that he's not in the military anymore, that he's living in the civilian world now." "He's been living in the civilian world for 18 years, Emma replied. "He's been successful in it, respected in it, valued in it. The only place he seems to have trouble is here with people who are supposed to be his family." The word family hung in the air like an accusation. These people who prided themselves on their closeness, their traditions, their shared values, were being forced to confront the fact that they'd been systematically excluding and diminishing one of their own. "Emma," I said quietly, stepping forward. "That's enough." "No, Dad, it's not enough." She turned to face me, her eyes blazing with the righteous anger I'd seen in her mother. "It's not enough that you stand here and let them treat you like you're some kind of charity case. It's not enough that you smile and nod while they make jokes about your clothes. You're bearing your grief." "Sweetheart, they don't know you," she continued, her voice growing stronger. "They don't know what you've accomplished, what you've sacrificed, what you've contributed. They see the outside, the old suit, the quiet demeanor, the military bearing, and they make assumptions about the inside." The group was watching this exchange with the fascination of people witnessing a car accident. Some looked uncomfortable, perhaps beginning to realize that their casual cruelty had gone too far. Others seemed annoyed that their fun was being spoiled by an overly dramatic daughter. "We all know Frank had a military career," Patricia said. Dismissively. "That's not news to anyone here, do you?" Emma asked, turning to face her aunt. "Do you really know what that means?" "Well, of course What did he do in the military?" Emma asked. "What was his job? What were his responsibilities?" Patricia's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Neither did anyone else's. They'd spent 5 years making assumptions about my military service based on stereotypes and Hollywood movies, but they'd never bothered to ask what I'd actually done. "He was in the Navy," Tom said finally, as if that explained everything. "He was a pilot," Emma said. "A fighter pilot. For 18 years, I felt the familiar tightness in my chest that always came when someone mentioned my flying career. It had been the defining experience of my life, the thing that had shaped me more than any other, but it was also the thing I talked about least in civilian circles." "Fighter pilot," Dale repeated, his tone suggesting he wasn't entirely convinced. "FA-18. Hornets," Emma continued. "Carrier-based. He logged over 3,000 flight hours, completed 427 carrier landings, served 3 combat tours in the Persian Gulf." The numbers seemed to have an impact. These were concrete achievements, measurable accomplishments that even civilians could understand and respect. "He flew missions over Iraq and Afghanistan," Emma said, her voice growing quieter but more intense. "He risked his life for his country while most of you were starting your careers and buying your first houses." "Emma," I said again, but she wasn't finished. "And when he left the military, he didn't just drift aimlessly like you seem to think. He built a successful career in aerospace engineering. He's worked on defense contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars. He's been promoted 5 times in 18 years. The patio had gone completely quiet. Even the children in the pool seemed to sense that something important was happening among the adults. But you don't know any of that, Emma continued, looking around the circle of faces, because you've never bothered to ask. You've been too busy judging his suit, his demeanor, his failure to laugh at your jokes. She paused, her eyes settling on Patricia. This man loved my mother with a devotion that few people ever experience. He was faithful to her for 27 years, present for every important moment in my life, strong enough to hold our family together when she was dying. Her voice cracked slightly, but she pressed on. When for the past 5 years, while he's been grieving the loss of the woman who was his whole world, you've been treating him like he's some kind of social embarrassment, like his pain is inconvenient, like his dignity is somehow offensive to your sense of how people should behave. I reached for her hand, but she stepped away, her attention focused entirely on the group of relatives who had been our tormentors for the evening. So yes, she said, her voice rising, he wears an old suit. Yes, he's quiet at social gatherings. He maintains military bearing even though he's been retired for years. And if any of that bothers you, if any of that makes you uncomfortable, then maybe the problem isn't with him. The silence that followed was absolute. No one seemed to know what to say, how to respond to being called out so directly and thoroughly. They'd been caught in their cruelty, forced to confront the ugliness of their behavior. And in that moment of silence, I realized that my daughter had done something I couldn't do for myself. She defended not just my appearance or my choices, but my essential dignity as a human being. She'd reminded the man, me, that respect wasn't something that had to be earned through conformity, but something that should be given freely to people who had lived with honor and integrity. The question now was what would happen next. The silence stretched across Patricia's patio like a held breath. Emma stood in the center of our small circle, her chest rising and falling with the intensity of her defense of me. The relatives who had been so quick with their judgments and casual cruelty now seemed unsure how to respond to being confronted with the reality of their behavior. I could see the calculations happening behind their eyes, the quick assessments of how to respond without losing face, how to retreat from their positions without admitting they'd been wrong. It was the same kind of tactical thinking I'd seen in military briefings. Except here the stakes were social rather than strategic. Dale was the first to try to recover, clearing his throat and putting on what he probably thought was a conciliatory expression. Look, Emma, I think you're being a little dramatic here. We weren't trying to hurt anyone's feelings. We were just making conversation. Conversation, Emma repeated, her voice flat. Is that what you call spending an entire evening making jokes about my father's appearance and questioning his ability to function in civilian society? We were just, Melissa started, but Emma cut her off. You were just what? Trying to help? Showing concern? Emma's legal training was evident in the way she dismantled their excuses before they could fully form them. Because from where I was standing, it looked like you were enjoying yourselves at his expense. Tom stepped forward, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. Emma, come on. We're family here. We can all get along without family, Emma interrupted, and there was something dangerous in her voice now. You want to talk about family? Then let me tell you what family looks like. She turned to face me, and I saw tears in her eyes, tears of anger and love and fierce protection. Family looks like a man who spent 18 years serving his country, and came home and spent the next 18 years being the best husband and father he knew how to be. Family looks like someone who held my mother's hand through 6 months of chemotherapy, who slept in a hospital chair for weeks, who never once complained about the burden or the pain. Her voice was getting stronger, more passionate, and I could see that she wasn't just defending me anymore. She was releasing years of pent-up frustration at watching me be diminished by people who should have valued me. Family looks like a man who established a scholarship fund in his wife's name, who volunteers at the VA hospital every week, who has helped dozens of veterans transition to civilian life. Family looks like someone who taught his daughter to stand up for what's right, to defend people who can't defend themselves, to never mistake kindness for weakness. The group was shifting uncomfortably now. Some were looking at their feet. Others were exchanging glances that suggested they were beginning to realize they'd misjudged the situation badly. But you don't know any of that, Emma continued, because you've been too busy being superior, too busy judging him for not conforming to your expectations of how a civilian should behave. Emma, honey, Patricia said, her voice carefully modulated to sound reasonable. I think we all respect your father's service. But that doesn't mean what? Emma demanded. That he deserves to be treated with basic human dignity. His choices about how to dress and behave should be respected. That maybe, just maybe, you should consider that his way of being in the world has value, even if it's different from yours. I felt something shift inside me as I listened to my daughter defend me with such passion and precision. For years I'd accepted the subtle dismissals and casual slights because I'd told myself they didn't matter, that my worth wasn't determined by other people's opinions. But watching Emma fight for my dignity made me realize that perhaps I'd been too willing to accept disrespect in the name of keeping peace. Emma, I said quietly, stepping closer to her. Thank you. She turned to look at me, her eyes still blazing. With protective fury, Dad, you don't have to thank me for. Yes, I do, I interrupted gently. Because you're right, about all of it. I looked around the circle of faces, seeing them clearly for perhaps the first time all evening. These weren't bad people necessarily, but they were limited people, limited by their experiences, their assumptions, their inability to see beyond their own narrow definitions of success and appropriate behavior. I did serve in the Navy for 18 years, I said, my voice carrying the authority I'd learned in command positions. I was a fighter pilot, flying FA-18 Hornets off aircraft carriers. I completed 427 carrier landings, which is considered one of the most dangerous routine operations in military aviation. The numbers seemed to have weight in the silence. These were achievements that even civilians could understand and respect. I served 3 combat tours in the Persian Gulf, I continued. I flew missions over hostile territory, where the margin for error was essentially zero, and the stakes were life and death. I was responsible for multi-million-dollar aircraft and the lives of the men and women who depended on me to do my job perfectly every single time. Dale's smirk had completely disappeared. Jennifer was staring at me with something approaching. Awe. Even Patricia looked like she was reassessing everything she thought she knew about me. When I left the military, I didn't just drift into civilian life. I earned a master's degree in aerospace engineering while working full-time, built a career in defense contracting, working on systems that protect the men and women who took my place in uniform. I paused, letting that sink in. I've been promoted 5 times in 18 years. I've managed projects worth hundreds of millions of dollars. I've received commendations from the Department of Defense for my contributions to national security. I'm not struggling in civilian life. I'm succeeding in it on my own terms. Tom opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it again. What could he say? His assumptions about my inability to adapt had just been systematically demolished. But more than any of that, I continued, I was married to Susan Reynolds for 27 years. I loved her with everything I had, supported her dreams, celebrated her successes, and held her hand while she died. I raised a daughter who has become everything her mother and I hoped she would be: strong, principled, compassionate, and brave enough to stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult. I looked directly at Emma, seeing pride and love in her eyes, and yes, I wear an old suit to family gatherings. Not because I can't afford a new one, not because I don't understand fashion, but because this suit represents something important to me. It's the suit I wore to my first civilian job interview, to Emma's high school graduation, to Susan's funeral. It's a bridge between who I was and who I became, a reminder of the journey that brought me to this point in my life. The silence was different now, uncomfortable but thoughtful, as if people were reconsidering everything they thought they knew. I maintain military bearing because it's part of who I am, I said. Listen more than I talk because I learned that you gain more information by observing than by speaking. I stand apart from groups initially because I'm assessing the social dynamics before engaging. These aren't character flaws. They're survival skills that served me well in the military and continue to serve me well in civilian life. I looked around the circle, meeting each person's eyes. I don't expect everyone to understand my choices or my way of being in the world, but I do expect to be treated with basic respect, especially by people who claim to be family. The word family had the same weight when I said it that it had carried when Emma used it, a reminder of obligations and connections that went deeper than surface judgments. Frank, Patricia said, her voice small and uncertain. We didn't know. You didn't know because you never asked, I replied, echoing Emma's earlier words. You made assumptions based on appearances and stereotypes. You decided who I was without bothering to learn who I actually am. Dale stepped forward, his face flushed with what might have been embarrassment or shame. Frank, I owe you an apology. You all do. Apologies are fine, I said, but understanding would be better. Help us understand, Jennifer said, and for the first time all evening her voice carried genuine sincerity. Tell us what we missed. I looked at Emma, who nodded encouragingly. Then I looked around the group, seeing past their expensive casual wear and suburban comfort to the human beings. Underneath, what you missed, I said, is that service and sacrifice come in many forms. What you missed is that dignity isn't determined by how much your clothes cost or how well you fit social expectations. What you missed is that there are different ways to be successful, different ways to contribute, different ways to honor the people and principles that matter to you. I paused, choosing my words carefully. What you missed is that the man you've been dismissing all evening has lived a life of purpose, has made sacrifices for ideals larger than himself, and has continued to serve his community and his country, even after leaving uniform. What you missed is that maybe, just maybe, the problem wasn't with me failing to meet your standards, but with your standards being too narrow to recognize value when it was standing right in front of you. The evening light was fading now, and someone had turned on the patio lights. The warm glow seemed to soften the hard edges of the confrontation, creating space for reflection and perhaps redemption. I think Tom said slowly, "We have a lot to learn about what it means to be family." I replied. We have a lot to learn about what it means to see each other clearly. And in that moment, I felt something I hadn't felt in years at a family gathering, the possibility of genuine connection, of being seen and valued for who I actually was rather than dismissed for who I wasn't. The question now was whether that possibility could become reality. But you chose to serve something bigger than yourself, Melissa said. You put your life on the line for people you'd never meet, in places most of us can't even pronounce. And when I came home, I chose to serve my family the same way, I replied, with dedication, commitment, and love. Service takes many forms. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of several cousins who had been inside watching a movie with the younger children. They emerged onto the patio laughing and talking, completely unaware of the transformation that had taken place. In their absence, "What's everyone being so serious about?" asked Sarah, Patricia's daughter, as she grabbed a soda from the outdoor refrigerator. "We're learning about Uncle Frank's military service," Tom said, and there was something different in his voice when he said Uncle Frank. Respect, perhaps even affection. "Oh, cool," Sarah said, settling into a chair. "Mom never talks about that stuff. What did you do in the military, Uncle Frank?" And so I found myself telling the stories again to a new audience, but this time the telling felt different. The questions were eager rather than dismissive. The attention was genuine, rather than grudging. Emma sat beside me, occasionally adding details or corrections, clearly proud to be sharing her father with people who were finally willing to see him clearly. As the evening wore on, the conversation expanded beyond my military service to my civilian career, my volunteer work, my relationship with Susan, my pride in Emma's accomplishments. People who had spent the day treating me like a social oddity were now treating me like a valued member of the family.
Oh.
Frank, Patricia said as the evening began to wind down. "I want to ask you something, and I want you to be honest with me." "All right. Have you been dreading these family gatherings? Have you been coming only because you felt obligated?" I considered the question carefully, weighing honesty against diplomacy. "Yes," I said finally. "For the past few years, yes, not because I don't love this family or value our connections, but because I felt ... misunderstood, judged, like I was being tolerated rather than welcomed." "That's our fault," Tom said immediately. "That's entirely our fault. It's nobody's fault," I replied. "It's just what happens when people don't take the time to really know each other. When we make assumptions instead of asking questions." "Will you give us another chance?" Patricia asked. "Will you help us do better?" I looked around the circle of faces, seeing people I'd known for 20 years as if for the first time. They weren't perfect, none of us were, but they were capable. Of growth, of recognition, of change. Of course, I said. Family is about second chances. Emma leaned against me, her head on my shoulder. I'm proud of you, Dad, she whispered. For your service, for your dignity, for your grace tonight. I'm proud of you too, sweetheart, I whispered back. For defending me when I couldn't defend myself, for refusing to let them diminish me, for standing up for what's right. As we prepared to leave, something remarkable happened. People who had barely acknowledged me when I arrived were now shaking my hand, thanking me for my service, asking when they could see me again. The same suit that had been an object of mockery earlier was now treated with respect, as if they could finally see what it represented. Frank Dale said as we reached the front door, I want you to know that this evening changed me, really changed me. I'll never look at veterans the same way again. Just remember, I said, that we're all individuals. My story isn't every veteran's story, but we all deserve to be seen as complete human beings, not as stereotypes or assumptions. I'll remember, he promised. As Emma and I walked to our cars, under the stars, she was quiet for a long moment before speaking. Dad, why didn't you ever defend yourself like that before? Why did you let them treat you that way for so long? I thought about her question, considering how to explain something I wasn't entirely sure I understood myself. I suppose, I said. Finally, I thought their opinions didn't matter enough to fight about. I thought I was above needing their approval or understanding, and now I realize that while I don't need their approval to have worth, I do deserve their respect. And more importantly, you deserve to see your father treated with dignity. She hugged me tight, and I could feel her tears against my shirt. Love. You, Dad, she said. I love you too, sweetheart. Thank you for believing in me enough to fight for me. As I drove home through the quiet streets of Charlotte, I reflected on the evening's events. My old suit, which had been a source of embarrassment and judgment earlier in the day, now felt like exactly what it had always been, a symbol of transition, of growth, of the bridge between who I had been and who I had become. The evening had taught me something important, that dignity wasn't something you possessed in isolation, but something you shared with others. That respect wasn't just about being worthy of it, but about demanding it when it was unjustly withheld. That family wasn't just about blood relations, but about the willingness to see each other clearly and love each other anyway. I was still the same man I'd been that morning when I'd put on my old suit, but somehow I felt different, seen, understood, valued for who I was rather than diminished for who I wasn't, and that, I thought, was worth more than any new suit could ever be.